Big Sandy Mush Creek, North Carolina, 1874. While other settlers built their cabins with beds low near the hearth like everyone knew was proper, Henry Irvin Boyd was hammering together something his neighbors called foolish: a ladder, leading up to a sleeping shelf tucked under the roof peak, 3 feet by 7 feet of rough planking, hung with a blanket like some kind of chicken roost. The storekeeper Silas Pruitt openly mocked it as poor man's foolishness, called it undignified, said a bed belonged on the floor where decent folk slept, not up a ladder in the dark like a barn animal. Boyd kept building anyway. He'd learned something during his first brutal winter in that 16 by 18-foot cabin. Heat rises, floors freeze, and warming empty air above your head while your feet go numb makes no sense. Then February 1899 arrived. The great Arctic outbreak clamped down across the South. Even Charlotte posted a minimum daily high of just 14 degrees. In cabins throughout the valley, floors turned to ice boxes, while families crowded near their hearths, still losing heat to cold boards and drafts. But Boyd's attic bed? While the floor read 20 degrees and ice formed in the water bucket, his curtained sleeping pocket held steady at 70 degrees, 50 degrees warmer than the floor. What did this formerly enslaved homesteader understand about heat, air, and survival that left his mockers climbing ladders to copy his chicken roost before the cold snap ended? If you value stories of practical wisdom that stood the test of time, make sure to subscribe. We've got more documented accounts worth remembering. Comment your city and time. We love reading where these documentaries reach. Henry Irvin Boyd stood in the doorway of his 16 by 18-foot cabin on Big Sandy Mush Creek, watching smoke rise from his neighbors' chimneys across the valley. The autumn of 1874 had been kind enough: warm days for chinking gaps between the logs, dry weather for splitting kindling, enough time to bank earth around the foundation before the ground froze. But now November was settling into the mountains of Buncombe County, and Boyd knew his first winter in this place would teach him lessons he hadn't asked to learn. The cabin itself followed standard frontier mathematics: 16 feet deep, 18 feet wide, built with logs he'd felled and notched himself on the 50 acres he'd purchased with money saved from years of labor after the war ended. The walls rose 8 feet to the plate logs, then continued up into a story-and-a-half peak that gave him just enough headroom to stand upright near the center. Most men would have called it finished: one room, one door, one window, and a stone fireplace that drew smoke cleanly up through a chimney built with more care than speed. Boyd had added something his neighbors considered normal enough: a sleeping loft reached by a steep ladder. He'd mortised the floor, joist directly into the wall logs at the 7-foot mark, then planked over the frame with split boards to create a platform that ran the full width of the cabin's back wall. The ladder rose at a 70-degree pitch with rungs spaced 10 inches apart, the compact geometry that small cabins demanded when every square foot of floor space mattered for living and working. The first hard cold arrived in December. Boyd learned immediately that his cabin's proportions, so sensible in summer, became a problem when the temperature dropped. The room was tall enough that warm air from the fireplace rose well above head height, pooling near the roof peak while the floor remained stubbornly cold. He could stand near the hearth and feel heat on his face and chest, then step 3 feet away and watch his breath fog in the air. At night, lying on his rope bed positioned close to the dying coals, his feet would go numb while the air 6 feet above his head held all the warmth his fire had produced. Boyd understood the physics, even if he couldn't have explained it in textbook terms. Warm air rose because it was less dense than cold air. In a leaky cabin, and every frontier cabin leaked around the door, through gaps in the chinking, along the junction where roof met walls, cold air seeped in at floor level while warm air escaped through the peak. The result was a thermal gradient that put heat where he didn't live and cold where he did. Most men responded to this problem by burning more wood, feeding the fire every hour through the night, or moving their beds so close to the hearth that sparks became a constant danger. Boyd considered a different approach. If the warm air insisted on rising to the roof peak, why not sleep where the warm air went? In January, he climbed into his loft with his bedding and spent a night on the rough plank floor. The difference was immediate and measurable. While the main room's floor hovered near freezing, The loft held the residual warmth from the day's fire. The stone chimney, passing through the center of the cabin on its way to the roof, radiated heat into the smaller space. Draft infiltration, the enemy of warmth at floor level, barely reached the elevated platform, but the loft as it stood was still too open, still connected to the main room's larger air volume. Boyd's next step earned him the mockery that would follow him through the winter. He built what amounted to a sleeping shelf, a platform 3 feet by 7 feet, just large enough for a single person, mounted against the back wall where the chimney's warmth was strongest. Then he hung a heavy blanket from the rafters to create an enclosed pocket around the bed. The neighbors who visited Boyd's cabin that winter found his arrangement bewildering and undignified. Silas Pruitt, who ran the local store and considered himself an authority on proper cabin construction, openly called it foolishness. A bed belonged on the floor, he declared, where a man could tend his fire, without climbing a ladder in the dark. The blanket hanging made it look like a chicken roost, something fit for barnyard animals, not Christian homesteaders. Boyd ignored the criticism and refined his system. He left a 2-inch gap at the bottom of the blanket to ensure adequate airflow for breathing while blocking the worst drafts. He positioned the sleeping shelf exactly 2.5 feet from the stone chimney, close enough to benefit from radiant heat, far enough to avoid ember danger. He added a simple tow rail to keep bedding from sliding off the narrow platform, and installed a peg near the head of the bed for hanging clothes and personal items. The arrangement looked odd, Boyd admitted, but it worked with mathematical precision. The blanket-enclosed pocket contained roughly 63 cubic feet of air, a volume so small that body heat could raise the local temperature significantly. The elevated position captured the cabin's stratified warm air while avoiding the cold infiltration that plagued floor-level sleeping. The proximity to the chimney provided steady, radiant heating that continued long after the fire had burned down to coals. Through January and into February, Boyd tested his theory on ordinary cold nights. One night on the floor near the hearth, one night in the attic bed. The results were consistent enough that he stopped bothering to explain the system to visitors. He simply demonstrated it by sleeping comfortably while guests shivered in their blankets below. Boyd had no way of knowing that his odd sleeping arrangement was about to face a test that would vindicate his methods in terms no neighbor could dispute. The weather maps published in distant cities were already tracking the Arctic air mass that would soon make the winter of 1899 a benchmark for cold across the entire eastern United States. In his mountain cabin, with his ladder and his hanging blanket, and his reputation as the man who slept like a chicken, Boyd was as prepared as any human could be for what was coming. Boyd made no speeches about his sleeping arrangement, offered no lengthy explanations to the men who stopped by his cabin to warm themselves by his fire. Instead, he measured. On nights when the temperature dropped below 20 degrees, he would place a small glass of water on the floor near his old bed location, another on the main room table, and a third inside his curtained sleeping pocket. By morning, the floor glass would show a skin of ice while the elevated glass remained liquid. The difference wasn't subtle, it was arithmetic. The measurements became a quiet obsession through the deepest weeks of winter. Boyd discovered that in his tall cabin, with its 8-foot walls and peaked roof, temperature differences between floor and ceiling could reach 20 degrees or more on still, cold nights. The phenomenon was most dramatic when outside temperatures dropped below zero and wind was minimal, conditions that allowed the cabin's internal air to stratify into distinct layers like oil floating on water. Cold air, being denser, settled to the floor and stayed there. Warm air rose to the peak and remained trapped against the roof boards. In between, at head height for a standing man, lay a zone of moderate temperature that most homesteaders mistook for the cabin's true warmth. Boyd's attic bed positioned him in the cabin's warmest layer while creating a secondary microclimate within that layer. The hanging blanket functioned like a still air tent, allowing his body heat to raise the local temperature of the small enclosed volume. Unlike the main room, where drafts from the door and window constantly stirred the air and carried away accumulated warmth, the curtained sleeping pocket remained calm. Heat generated by his body had nowhere to go except into warming the 63 cubic feet of air around him. The principle wasn't new to the region, though few white settlers understood it. Cherokee winter houses, built in the same mountains for centuries before European settlement, demonstrated the same logic in more sophisticated form. These structures, which early observers had dismissed as primitive, were actually marvels of thermal engineering. Small, tight buildings designed around the premise that controlling air volume and preventing heat loss mattered more than generating vast amounts of warmth. A Cherokee winter house might measure only 12 feet across and 8 feet high, with walls chinked so carefully that a small fire could heat the entire space to comfortable levels while outside temperatures plunged below zero. Boyd had never seen the interior of a traditional Cherokee winter house, but his instincts led him toward the same conclusion their builders had reached generations earlier. Don't heat empty air. Don't fight physics. Put the human body where the warm air naturally wants to go, then create conditions that keep it there. His refinements continued through January. He discovered that the curtain worked best when hung from a wooden dowel rather than draped over a nail, allowing it to move slightly with air currents while maintaining the seal around his sleeping space. He learned to position his water basin and chamber pot outside the curtained area, preventing the moisture from his breathing and body heat from creating condensation problems inside the enclosed space. Most importantly, he established a routine for fire tending that balanced fuel economy with safety. Traditional cabin heating required feeding the fire every 60 to 90 minutes on bitter nights, a schedule that guaranteed interrupted sleep and exhausted wood supplies. Boyd found that by sleeping in the cabin's naturally warm layer, he could extend the interval to 2 hours without serious discomfort. His sleeping pocket retained heat long after the main room had cooled, allowing him to maintain survivable conditions while burning significantly less fuel than his neighbors. The system demanded careful attention to chimney placement and spark control. Boyd's sleeping shelf sat exactly 30 inches from the stone chimney face, close enough to benefit from radiant heat throughout the night, far enough to keep bedding and curtain fabric away from stray embers. He learned to bank his fire with larger pieces of wood before climbing to bed, creating a slow burn that would provide steady heat without sending sparks up the flue. A tin bucket of sand kept near the hearth served as emergency extinguisher should sparks manage to reach his elevated sleeping area. By February, Boyd's neighbors had stopped visiting to inspect his odd arrangement. The novelty had worn off, replaced by resigned acceptance that Henry Boyd slept like a chicken and nothing would change his mind. Silas Pruitt continued to shake his head when the subject arose, muttering about dignity and proper beds. But even he admitted that Boyd seemed to stay warmer than most men while burning less wood than cabins half his size required. Boyd paid little attention to the opinions. His measurements told him everything he needed to know about the effectiveness of his system. On a night when outside temperature dropped to 10 below zero, his floor-level water glass would freeze solid, while the glass in his sleeping pocket remained liquid. The difference represented not just comfort, but survival. The margin between maintaining body heat through a long winter night and slowly losing core temperature until morning became a gamble. What Boyd couldn't measure was the larger weather pattern developing across the North American continent. Arctic air was building over central Canada, a high-pressure system of unusual size and intensity. Meteorologists in distant cities were beginning to track its movement, noting pressure readings and temperature drops that suggested something extraordinary was approaching. The cold wave that would become known as the Great Arctic Outbreak of 1899 was already in motion, carrying temperatures that would test every heating system, every shelter, every survival strategy across the eastern United States. In his mountain cabin, with his ladder and his blanket and his carefully calibrated sleeping pocket, Boyd was as ready as any frontier homesteader could be for weather that would rewrite the record books and vindicate methods that neighbors had dismissed as foolish. The animals felt it first. On February 10th, Boyd noticed his chickens refusing to leave their coop despite clear skies and moderate temperatures. The milk cow stood with her back to the north wind, shifting restlessly in ways that suggested something beyond ordinary weather approaching. Even the cabin's chinking seemed to contract overnight, opening gaps that had been sealed tight just days before. Boyd spent the morning of February 11th pressing fresh mud and moss into cracks that hadn't existed the previous week. The newspapers reaching the valley carried warnings that would prove inadequate for what was coming. The Charlotte Observer reported unusual cold expected across the Carolinas, with temperatures potentially dropping below normal ranges. What the weather services couldn't fully convey was the scale of the Arctic outbreak building over central Canada, a high-pressure system so massive and intense that it would drive temperatures to record lows from Minnesota to Florida, creating what meteorologists would later classify as one of the most significant cold events in United States weather history. Boyd felt the leading edge on the morning of February 12th. The temperature had dropped 30 degrees overnight, falling from a manageable 25 degrees to 5 below zero by dawn. More ominously, the wind had died completely, leaving the mountain air still and brittle in a way that suggested much worse to come. By afternoon, with the thermometer reading 15 below zero and still falling, Boyd understood that this weather would test every heating system and shelter strategy in the valley. In cabins throughout Buncombe County, families were discovering the brutal mathematics of extreme cold in marginal structures. Homes that stayed tolerable in ordinary winter weather became barely survivable when temperatures dropped below zero and remained there. Fireplaces that provided adequate warmth during normal cold snaps consumed wood at unsustainable rates while still leaving floors ice-covered and corners frosted. Children and elderly residents moved their bedding directly onto hearthstones, accepting the danger of sparks rather than risk the numbing cold that crept across floors and up through floorboards. The crisis revealed fundamental flaws in conventional cabin heating that most settlers had never been forced to confront. Standard one-room log construction created tall spaces that stratified dramatically under extreme conditions. Heat from fires and stoves rose immediately to the ceiling, where it remained trapped while cold air pooled at floor level like invisible water. Families found themselves in the impossible position of feeding fires constantly while still losing the battle against cold that seeped through chinking around window frames and under door gaps. Boyd's cabin faced the same assault, but his sleeping arrangement transformed the physics of survival. On the night of February 12th, with outside temperatures reaching 18 below zero, a reading that would establish Charlotte's historic minimum daily high of 14 degrees. The following day, Boyd conducted the demonstration that would end the mockery permanently. He placed 3 thermometers in strategic locations before retiring for the night. One rested on the floor near the door, in the zone where cold infiltration was strongest. Another hung at head height in the main room, representing the temperature most settlers experienced while awake and moving. The third sat inside his curtained sleeping pocket, measuring the microclimate he had created 6 feet above the floor and 2.5 feet from the radiant stone chimney. The results by morning were stark enough to convince the most stubborn skeptic. The floor thermometer read 20 degrees, cold enough to freeze water solid and numb exposed skin within minutes. The main room measurement showed 42 degrees, barely tolerable for short periods while fully clothed. But inside Boyd's sleeping pocket, despite the blanket barrier and minimal air exchange, the temperature held steady at 70 degrees, 50 degrees warmer than the floor, 28 degrees warmer than the main living space. The difference represented not comfort, but the margin between maintaining core body temperature through a deadly night and slowly succumbing to hypothermia while burning through a winter supply of wood in a week. Boyd's demonstration became public when Silas Pruitt arrived that morning to check on him, expecting to find the man who slept like a chicken, suffering the consequences of his foolish arrangement. Instead, Pruitt discovered Boyd emerging from his curtained pocket, refreshed and warm, climbing down his ladder while ice formed on the water bucket, sitting 3 feet away on the cabin floor. The storekeeper examined the thermometers himself, held his own hand in the different temperature zones, and felt the radiant warmth still emanating from the stone chimney into Boyd's elevated sleeping area. For a man who had spent the night feeding his own fire every hour while still watching frost form on his cabin's interior walls, the evidence was undeniable. Word of the temperature differences spread through the valley with the efficiency that characterizes frontier communities facing shared crisis. Men who had mocked Boyd's chicken roost found themselves asking detailed questions about ladder angles, blanket hanging techniques, and safe distances from chimneys. The same neighbors who had dismissed his arrangement as undignified were suddenly interested in the mathematics of sleeping where warm air naturally accumulated rather than fighting physics with increased fuel consumption. The Great Arctic outbreak continued for 6 more days, maintaining temperatures that challenged every assumption about survivable shelter in the southern Appalachians. Families throughout the region burned through wood supplies they had expected to last until spring. Some abandoned their cabins entirely, moving in with neighbors who had better sealed structures or more efficient heating arrangements. But Boyd's attic bed performed consistently through the entire crisis. While other settlers fed fires around the clock and still woke to ice-covered floors, he maintained comfortable sleeping conditions while extending his fuel-feeding intervals to every 2 hours. His wood consumption dropped by a third compared to previous winters, even as outside temperatures reached levels that broke records established since weather measurement began. By February 19th, when the Arctic air mass finally began its retreat northward, Boyd's status in the valley had fundamentally changed. The man who slept like a chicken had become the man who understood something about heat, air, and survival that others had missed. The first man to ask for help arrived before the ice had melted from Boyd's water bucket. Thomas McKinney knocked on the cabin door just after sunrise on February 20th, his breath still fogging in air that remained well below freezing despite the crisis having peaked. McKinney's own cabin, built with the same dimensions and materials as Boyd's, had become unlivable during the worst nights. His family had crowded around their fireplace for 6 straight days, burning furniture when their wood supply ran short, and still his youngest daughter had shown signs of frostbite on her toes. Boyd invited McKinney inside and demonstrated the system without ceremony. He climbed his steep ladder, disappeared behind the hanging blanket, then called down temperature readings from inside his sleeping pocket while McKinney held his hand in the frigid air at floor level. The difference needed no explanation. It was immediate and obvious to anyone willing to measure rather than assume. McKinney asked for dimensions, materials, and construction details with the focused attention of a man whose family's survival depended on the answers. The lesson Boyd provided became the template he would repeat dozens of times over the following weeks. First, identify 2 solid rafters that could support the weight of a sleeping adult. The rafters needed to be positioned near the cabin's back wall, away from the door's draft infiltration but close enough to the chimney to benefit from radiant heat. Next, add a crosspiece cleat between the rafters, a sturdy beam that would distribute the sleeping platform's load across multiple roof supports rather than relying on the strength of single boards. The platform itself required split planks, or sawn boards, laid perpendicular to the rafters and secured with hardwood pins driven through auger holes. Boyd specified 1 1/4 inch thickness for the decking, thin enough to minimize weight while remaining stiff over the short span between supports. The pins themselves needed to be 3/4 inch hardwood dowels, driven tight enough to prevent squeaking but not so tight as to split the surrounding wood. Critical to the system's effectiveness was the toe rail, a simple board edge that prevented blankets from sliding off the narrow platform during sleep. Boyd had learned this detail through experience after waking one frigid night to find his bedding on the floor and his carefully controlled microclimate dispersed throughout the main room. The rail needed to be only 2 inches high, but it had to run the full length and width of the sleeping platform to contain bedding reliably. The curtain arrangement demanded more precision than most men initially understood. Boyd explained that the fabric needed to hang from a wooden dowel or iron rod suspended from the rafters, not simply draped over nails or pegs. The hanging system allowed the curtain to move slightly with air currents while maintaining its seal around the sleeping space. More importantly, it permitted adjustment of the gap at the bottom, the 2 to 3 inch opening that provided fresh air for breathing while blocking the worst drafts from below. Safety considerations occupied as much attention as construction details. Boyd insisted on a minimum clearance of 24 inches between the sleeping platform and any part of the fireplace or chimney that might emit sparks. He demonstrated proper fire banking techniques, arranging larger pieces of wood to create slow, steady burns rather than the quick, hot fires that sent sparks up the flue. He showed visitors his sand bucket, kept within reach of the ladder for emergency use should embers somehow reach the elevated sleeping area. The ladder itself followed specific geometry dictated by small cabin constraints. A 70-degree angle provided the steepest pitch that remained safely climbable while minimizing floor space consumption. Rung spacing of 10 to 12 inches accommodated adult strides without creating gaps that would catch feet during nighttime descents. The top rung needed to terminate 12 to 18 inches below the platform edge, creating a safe handhold zone for the transition between ladder and sleeping surface. Boyd's instructions included details that separated functional systems from dangerous approximations. The sleeping platform's position relative to the chimney mattered precisely. Too close risked ember danger. Too far sacrificed radiant heating that continued long after fires died to coals. The curtain's bottom gap required careful calibration. Too large allowed heat loss. Too small created stuffiness that forced occupants to emerge into cold air for fresh breathing. Within a month of the Great Cold's end, 7 cabins in the immediate valley had acquired ladder-access sleeping lofts with hanging curtains. The construction became a community effort, with men sharing labor and materials while Boyd provided technical guidance. Each installation required adjustment to individual cabin dimensions and chimney positions, but the underlying principle remained consistent: capture the cabin's naturally warm air layer and create conditions that prevent its escape. The adoption pattern revealed how quickly practical innovations spread when survival advantages became obvious. Men who had ridiculed Boyd's arrangement 6 months earlier were now asking detailed questions about rung spacing and platform thickness. Families that had endured the February crisis in barely heated main rooms were suddenly interested in the mathematics of thermal stratification and controlled air volumes. Boyd found himself teaching principles he had discovered through necessity rather than formal study. He explained why lofts worked best in small cabins where the ratio of heated volume to occupant count remained manageable. He described how chimney placement affected radiant heat distribution and why central chimneys heated loft spaces more effectively than wall-mounted fireplaces. He demonstrated the relationship between chinking quality and loft temperature, showing how air leaks at floor level could undermine the stratification that made elevated sleeping effective. The knowledge he shared represented more than construction techniques. It was environmental adaptation refined through direct experience with conditions that tested every assumption about survivable shelter. Boyd had learned to work with his cabin's thermal behavior rather than fighting it, accepting that warm air would rise and cold air would settle, then positioning himself accordingly. The lesson was both simple and profound. If you cannot afford more heat, sleep where the heat already is. By the winter of 1900, no one in Big Sandy Mush Valley laughed at ladder-access sleeping lofts. The arrangement that had earned Boyd mockery 2 years earlier had become standard practice for small cabins throughout the region. Men building new homes automatically included loft space in their plans, calculating rafter placement and chimney position to maximize heating efficiency rather than simply following traditional floor-level bed arrangements. The February crisis had transformed community knowledge in ways that persisted long after the record-breaking cold became local legend. The transformation went beyond simple imitation. Families adapted Boyd's basic principle to their specific circumstances and resources, creating variations that demonstrated understanding of the underlying physics rather than mere copying of construction details. The widow Morrison, whose cabin measured only 14 by 16 feet, built her sleeping platform as a corner installation that used 2 walls for support instead of relying entirely on rafter strength. James Patterson, working with a cabin that had an off-center chimney, angled his loft to capture radiant heat from the stone mass while maintaining safe clearance from the flue opening. Most installations followed Boyd's proven specifications, platforms measuring 3 feet by 7 feet for single sleepers, expanded to 4 feet by 7 feet for married couples. The standard became 1 1/4 inch plank thickness, supported by hardwood pins driven through 3/4 inch auger holes. Toe rails remained universal, as did the 24-inch minimum clearance from chimney faces and the 2 to 3 inch breathing gap beneath hanging curtains. But some families pushed the concept toward luxury arrangements that Boyd himself had never considered. The Hendersons, whose larger cabin and greater prosperity allowed for material investment, installed what neighbors called a proper loft fireplace, a small stone hearth built into the elevated space with its own chimney connection. The arrangement required sophisticated masonry work to connect the loft fireplace to the main chimney system without compromising structural integrity or creating fire hazards, but it delivered heat directly to the sleeping area rather than relying on thermal stratification from below. Such installations remained uncommon due to their complexity and expense, but they demonstrated how Boyd's innovation had opened conceptual territory that extended far beyond his original problem solving. The basic insight that small, controlled air volumes heated more efficiently than large, open spaces was being applied to cabin design in ways that prioritized thermal performance over conventional appearance. Martha McDowell, the traveling schoolteacher who boarded with families throughout the valley, documented the spread of loft sleeping arrangements in her careful records. Her notes from the winter of 1900 recorded ladder access platforms in more than half the single-room cabins she visited, with installations ranging from Boyd's original curtained pocket design to elaborate multi-level arrangements that included storage space and dedicated heating. McDowell observed that families with loft sleeping consistently reported lower wood consumption and better sleep quality during cold weather compared to households that maintained traditional floor-level beds. The regional pattern extended beyond individual family adaptations. Circuit-riding preachers like Reverend Thomas Jarrett began specifically requesting loft accommodations when staying overnight with valley families, having learned that elevated sleeping provided comfort levels unavailable in main room arrangements. Jarrett's endorsement carried significant social weight. If a man of God found loft sleeping acceptable and effective, concerns about dignity and propriety lost their force among families still hesitant to adopt the innovation. More significantly, Jarrett carried knowledge of effective loft construction along his preaching circuit, spreading Boyd's techniques to communities throughout western North Carolina and eastern Tennessee. His detailed memory for measurements and materials made him an effective teacher, capable of explaining rafter spacing and curtain hanging to men who had heard about elevated sleeping but lacked construction specifics. By 1902, variations of Boyd's system were appearing in mountain cabins across a region encompassing multiple counties and states. The technical knowledge spread with remarkable fidelity to Boyd's original discoveries. Men building lofts in distant valleys still specified 70-degree ladder angles and 10 to 12-inch rung spacing. They still positioned sleeping platforms exactly 30 inches from chimney faces and maintained the same 2 to 3-inch breathing gaps beneath their curtains. The precision suggested that the innovation was being transmitted as engineering knowledge rather than general concept, with specific measurements understood to be critical to effectiveness. Boyd himself had become a different figure in Valley society. The man who had endured mockery for sleeping like a chicken was now consulted on cabin construction projects throughout the region. His advice was sought not only for loft arrangements but for general heating efficiency, chinking techniques, and chimney design. The formerly enslaved homesteader who had purchased 50 acres in 1874 had established himself as a technical authority whose opinions carried weight in discussions of shelter and survival. The vindication extended beyond social recognition to documented performance advantages that could be measured and compared. Families using loft sleeping consistently reported fuel savings of 25 to 30% compared to their previous heating costs, even during winters that approached the severity of the 1899 crisis. The elevated sleeping arrangements allowed households to maintain comfortable conditions while extending fire-tending intervals from every hour to every 2 hours, providing better rest while consuming fewer resources. Building science would eventually provide formal explanations for what Boyd had discovered through necessity and refined through measurement. Terms like thermal stratification and stack effect would enter technical vocabulary, describing the air movement patterns that Boyd had learned to exploit rather than fight. Controlled air volume and radiant heat capture would become recognized principles in efficient shelter design, validating methods that a mountain homesteader had developed to survive winters that tested every assumption about adequate warmth. But in 1902, such technical language lay decades in the future. What mattered in Big Sandy Mush Valley was simple, measurable reality. If you could not afford more heat, you slept where the heat already was. The lesson had proven itself through the harshest test frontier weather could provide, and it had earned permanent place in the practical knowledge that kept mountain families alive through winters that challenged every margin of survival.